Alex Eala just entered the top 20. Read that again. A Filipino tennis player who not long ago was still being introduced to the world as a rising prospect has now reached a ranking that changes everything. But here's the part that makes this story even more interesting. The top 20 might not actually be the biggest thing happening to Alex Eala right now. Because while the ranking looks like the headline, what is happening behind that number could be far more important. Alex isn't simply climbing a ranking. She is entering a completely different level of women's tennis. And if the trajectory continues, the next chapter could be much bigger than anyone expected. For years, Alex Eala's journey has been about potential. She was talented. She was disciplined. She had an impressive junior career. She trained at the prestigious Rafael Nadal Academy, and she repeatedly showed that she could compete against players with much more experience. But tennis is a brutal sport. Potential means very little if you cannot turn it into results. And Alex has now reached the point where results are starting to speak louder than potential. That is what makes this moment so significant. Breaking into the top 20 means Alex is no longer simply chasing established stars. She is becoming one of the players those stars have to watch. Every tournament becomes different when your ranking changes. The draws become more complicated. Expectations become higher. Opponents prepare differently. And suddenly, you are no longer the surprise player. You are the player everyone knows about. That transition is one of the hardest parts of professional tennis. A young player can shock the world once. Doing it again and again is something completely different. And that is exactly where Alex Eala finds herself now. The question is no longer, can Alex Eala compete with the best? We already have evidence that she can. The bigger question is, how far can she actually go? Because the top 20 could be just the beginning. Think about what happens when a player starts consistently entering major tournaments with a higher ranking. She gets better opportunities. She faces elite opponents more regularly. She gains experience on the biggest courts. And most importantly, she begins to understand what it takes to survive deep into tournaments at the highest level. That experience compounds. One breakthrough leads to another. A difficult match becomes a lesson. A big victory creates confidence. A disappointing loss reveals another weakness. And slowly, the player who once surprised everyone starts becoming a genuine contender. That may be the stage Alex is entering right now. And there is another factor that makes her rise especially fascinating. Alex Eala is not coming from one of the traditional powerhouses of women's tennis. She represents the Philippines. And that matters. Because every major result she produces has an impact beyond the ranking itself. When Alex wins, millions of Filipino fans pay attention. Young athletes who may have never imagined professional tennis as a realistic career suddenly have someone they can look up to. That is how a player can become bigger than the sport. And Alex is already showing signs of that effect. Her story has become a national story. Her matches are being followed by people who may not have watched professional tennis before. Her success is creating conversations about tennis in the Philippines. And the higher she climbs, the bigger that effect becomes. Imagine what happens if Alex reaches the top 10. Imagine what happens if she becomes a Grand Slam quarterfinalist, a semi-finalist, or even a Grand Slam champion. At that point, this is no longer just a tennis success story. It becomes a sporting transformation. And that is why the top 20 ranking is so important. It creates a platform. But Alex still has something much bigger to chase. The next challenge is consistency. Getting into the top 20 is one thing. Staying there is another. The best players in the world aren't defined by one incredible tournament. They're defined by how they perform week after week. That means Alex will now have to deal with something she didn't have to face in exactly the same way before. Expectation. When you're the underdog, everything feels like a bonus. You defeat a higher-ranked player, and everyone celebrates. You make a deep run, and people call it a breakthrough. But once you're ranked inside the top 20, people start expecting those results. That psychological shift can be enormous. Every loss gets analyzed. Every early exit becomes a headline. Every injury becomes a concern. And every tournament becomes another test of whether the rise is sustainable. But Alex's development suggests she has already learned how to handle pressure. She has been competing internationally from a young age. She has trained in an environment built around elite performance. She has experienced the intensity of major tournaments. And perhaps most importantly, she has already gone through moments when the world suddenly started watching. Those experiences matter. Because the players who eventually become stars aren't necessarily the ones who never feel pressure. They're the ones who learn how to perform while feeling it. And there is another reason fans should be watching Alex closely. Her game is still developing. That may sound obvious, but it's actually one of the most exciting parts of her story. When a player reaches the top 20 while still having areas of her game that can improve, the ceiling can become extremely high. More power, more consistency, better serving, improved movement, stronger tactical decisions, greater experience against different styles. Every improvement can potentially push her closer to the very top. And this is where the next few seasons could become fascinating. Because Alex isn't trying to become the best version of herself that existed yesterday. She's trying to become a better player every season. That is a completely different mindset. And if she continues developing at this pace, the top 20 could eventually look less like an achievement and more like a checkpoint. Of course, there are no guarantees. Tennis can change incredibly quickly. One injury can disrupt an entire season. A few early losses can affect confidence. The competition at the top is brutal. There are dozens of players capable of producing world-class tennis on any given day. So nobody should assume that Alex will automatically reach the top 10 or win a Grand Slam. But that's also what makes the story exciting. For the first time, those possibilities don't sound completely unrealistic. And perhaps the biggest sign of Alex's evolution is the way people are starting to talk about her.